So the historical gap is narrowed and the two horizons begin to merge. Now, you'll notice that that's essentially the way it is with interpersonal relationships. You see, if you're not sure if you understand what somebody is thinking or where they're coming from, you pose a question, is this what you're saying? And in the light of the response, you say, well, do you mean this? And then as the dialogue continues, oh, I see, so you mean this? Well, not quite, but you see, and on it goes and the horizons begin to meet. Now, what makes this possible is that the two subjectivities share a common history, a common cultural tradition that is carried by a common language. And so it is by means of that historical connection, the cultural connection, the linguistic connection, that the dialogue is possible. And we get what he calls effective history. Effective history. But what is basically going on is that the reader, in trying to understand, the interpreter, in trying to understand, is trying to make the text he's trying to understand for me. You see? So you have that for me approach to the text that already is in itself. You see? You're trying to understand it. Now, you might say, well, that Sartrean language with its Kantian basis of the thing for me and the thing in itself is simply a guise for another representational theory of knowledge. You see? To which not so. Not so, because in this phenomenological tradition, the intentionality gives you the existence of the object, makes it present to you. The question is, what is it saying? What does it mean? So this phenomenology is more of a kind of critical realism, not a naive realism, but not an anti-realism. Critical realism, with its claim that we know that an object exists, but what it is, we have to be subject to correction. There is no infallible interpreter, if you like. So the representational thing is not really correct. However, as subsequent hermeneutical theory develops after Gadamer, then the problem begins to develop. Because people like Jacques Derrida, let's see, let's get his name down on the list. People like Jacques Derrida, the deconstructionist, seems to be an anti-realist, so that the text becomes inscrutable in the sense that you cannot get at any fixed meaning. Why is this? Well, for Derrida, the language that is used, you see, the language is used has a structure that is given to it by the author, but a structure that is, if you like, unconsciously given, and which simply never gets completely uncovered. The idea, going back to structural linguistics, is that that language is an artificial structure that is imposed on things, you see. And what the deconstructionist is doing is trying to take apart the structure and show it doesn't work. Whatever interpretation you give, what is supposed to refer to something just doesn't seem to refer consistently. So that any interpretation, any construction that you put upon it seems to fail. Your interpretation is as much an artificial superimposition as is the language that the writer himself has used, is an artificial imposition. And therefore it's impossible to understand what is happening. The dialogue is useful, but what precisely the reference of the language is, that cannot be understood by rational means. So in that sense, Derrida is an anti-realist about interpretation, and maintains in effect that a plurality of interpretations is legitimate, it's possible, and so a relativism of the whole plurality. Now, inasmuch as that kind of deconstructionism is applied not only to the reading of a particular text, but also to the understanding of the phenomena of religion, it applies to religious pluralism. And so the kind of relativism of the plurality of religious traditions, such as was discussed in the Religious Pluralism Conference, reflects the same kind of emphasis, that we cannot see what all this makes, because the structures we put upon it vary from one subjective grid to another. Now, this European tradition that has developed out of the Kantian Copernican revolution through the notion of intentionality into deconstructionism has been picked up in Anglo-American philosophy, even though it's a European tradition. So that the work of Richard Rorty, in his book, entitled Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, I mentioned his name before in a Deweyan context, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, appeals as much to this phenomenological tradition of Heidegger as it does to the pragmatic tradition of Dewey, as it does to the Wittgenstein tradition that we'll be tapping into in another couple of weeks, you see. And bringing these together, common themes in these together, comes up essentially with the claim that we simply are unable to get at the truth about anything. The title of his book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, you recall, from when I mentioned it before, the mirror of nature refers to a representational theory of knowledge, so that we have mental images, like mirror images, within our mind that are copies, true copies of. Well, what he's doing is arguing with this subjectivist tradition coming out of Kant, arguing with the instrumentalist, phenomenalist tradition, people like Dewey, get it? You see, both of whom are anti-realists. What he's doing is arguing that any such realistic mirror image representation is just impossible. And what he does is essentially what skeptics about knowledge have done through history, is to say if I can't know exactly and with certainty, I'll be a skeptic. You see, a skeptic about that. So he advocates simply engaging in interesting dialogue rather than trying to settle questions. And he moved from teaching philosophy at Princeton to an interdisciplinary humanities program at Virginia. If philosophy is trying to answer questions, then he can be part of it. My point is that, my point in saying that he does the old move, saying if I cannot have exact understanding with certainty, I'm a skeptic, he's appealing to an illicit disjunction. That's not an all-inclusive classification of possibilities. You see. There's always been a kind of probabilistic tradition in between. And contemporary epistemology, of course, works a great deal with other traditions than those two, in terms of the justification of belief. So really, what this boils down to is a skepticism resulting from exaggerated epistemological expectations, which is the kind of phenomenon you find among freshmen in a beginning philosophy course, as well as among others. You see, if they come expecting knock-down, drag-out proofs that, so that you can know this or that with complete certainty, then if you can't have that, you're utterly at sea. There's nowhere else to turn. And while it's an oversimplification to say that's what Rorty is doing, at least it's the same kind of move, either certainty or skepticism, you see, rather than recognizing that all through the course of history there have been third alternatives introduced to slip between the horns of the dilemma. Okay, let's pause there. Questions, comments, discussion? Yeah.
When you speak of the structure of language with Derrida, what's an example of that, or what sort of structure?
Well, if you're going back to the structuralist linguistic, where the name that's usually referred to is the Frenchman de Saussure, whom I've never read, but I've read about him. What he seems to be doing, and let me put it this way, what he seems to be doing is taking a position something like what we'll be finding in 19th and 20th century positivism, 20th century particularly, where in their analysis of language they speak of two ingredients in language, one being factual references, and the other being the formal structures of language. Okay, so the formal structures are things like the subject-predicate structure, okay, formal structures, the rules by which language functions. And they separate these two, insisting that it's the meaning that is carried by the formal structure. You see. That's essential. Now, what the deconstructionist is doing is challenging that whole scheme, rejecting that whole scheme. Now, you can see that most clearly if by the structure of language you refer now, not to the whole formal structure of a logical language like, I'm going to say English, but if you refer rather to the language used in a particular philosophical text, literary text, okay, the way in which the words are put together, that structuring of the story, structuring of the account other than the story, so forth. And the attempt is made to show that when you try to grasp what the structure is, how it is put together, how the parts of the story interrelate, what are they referring to, you see, no interpretation really hangs together and works. Get it? What does it mean for an interpretation to work? Well, to make sense of the parts in a coherent fashion. You see. No interpretation does that. Makes sense of the parts in a coherent fashion. So deconstruction is named as the antithesis, to be the antithesis of structuralism. Language simply doesn't work for conveying unequivocal meanings with any certainty and clarity. I'm inclined to say, do you remember the pre-Socratic Gorgias, the sophist? Anybody remember Gorgias? Who said, he said, nothing exists. If anything exists, I couldn't know it. If I knew it, I couldn't talk about it. You see. You find skepticism extended not only to whether something exists, not only to knowing about something, but also skepticism to the viability of any language. You see. Linguistic skepticism. And this is what's involved.
Is that both on the opposite now and on the...
Yeah. I realize the term critical realism doesn't have much content at this juncture. It will do in another 10 days. But the nearest anticipation we have of it, I think, is Scottish realism. Back to Thomas Reid, okay? Where Reid is a realist about the existence of things. It maintains that we have an immediate awareness of something's existence that is given that becomes self-evident, is given along with certain sensory qualities which are signs that something is there. So you don't have to infer the existence of something. In other words, in the relationship between the mind and its object, what you have is a direct awareness of the existence of the object. So existence is given directly, you see. But the nature of the object we seem to gain through reflection on those signs, those sensory stimuli, so forth. Critical realism. Critical about what it is Now, the term critical realism itself comes from the 1920s, 1930s, when there was an American philosophical movement known as critical realism, which was essentially a continuation of the Scottish realist tradition in those 1920s and 30s. That's what we'll be talking about in a short while.
With this linguistic structure, though, how does an author understand linguistic criticism?
He doesn't. Same problem. You know. Do you ever discover that a teacher finds something in what you've written that you never thought was there? You see, doesn't the literature teacher tell us all the time that a text begins to take on a life of its own? You see? I find people writing reviews of stuff I write. I want to set them straight all the time. I've given up trying to do it. But, you see, they think I'm saying something I don't think I am saying. Once in a while, when I get into conversation with someone, but you said, oh yes, but I didn't mean that. The text says something I certainly didn't intend, consciously. Was there a subconscious? How do I know? So do I ever really understand what I mean? See, that's the way the argument goes. Oh, can you tell me about that? I'm rusty on that. Yep, Eleanor Stump. Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you delineate the levels of interpretation? Yeah, no, not. Yes, yes. Yeah. I don't remember precisely what that was. I remember very roughly that it was analogous to saying that a given passage has several levels of meaning. So that if you were taking, for instance, the book of Jonah, this is a hypothetical example. If you take the book of Jonah, you could read it as a narrative of something which actually happened. Whether or not it's intended to be or not is another question. But you can read it that way. If you do or if you don't, you can also read it as an analogy to what happened when the people of Israel ran away from God and got swallowed up by the Assyrians. You see? You could read it as that level of understanding. And of course, if you're reading it from the standpoint of the New Testament, as some people have tried to, you could read it as anticipating the resurrection of Christ, coming out from the jaws of death. You see? 3 levels of meaning. Now, that was the sort of thing, but I don't remember precisely what she meant, so don't read that to her. Yeah, and that was, I think, the salient thing that stands out in my memory of what she was doing. You remember she talked of a deistic interpretation. Now, obviously, she didn't literally mean deist. She was just saying that some interpreters act like deists, in that they regard interpretation as an entirely human, rational, almost mechanical process. Fixed laws in the absence of God, who established the laws and left us to function by the laws. It's sort of a deistic view of interpretation. And that Aquinas was, she suggested, more of a theistic kind of interpretation, in the sense that God is active in the interpretive process, in showing, illuminating a meaning which might not be accessible by strict mechanical laws of interpretation. I don't know what to think about that. Yeah, or at least it seems to open the way to shifting meanings, or what I sometimes call freshman Bible studies. Let's share what the text means to you. It can mean contradictory things to different people, but we all share our meanings. Well, that's not what she was meaning, I'm sure. But, I'd like to talk with her further and see how those things fit together. Yeah, you need checks on it. Yeah, and I guess I want to know if it's just traditional checks. I'm sure she'd say the first check would have to be the text itself. But if you say the text itself, then you're talking about appropriate rules for handling a text. You see. And if it's participating in the tradition of the church, then you're talking about their faithfulness to the text and what is grown out of the use of the text. Now, there may be in it, however, 2 further things. One is perhaps a rejection of an old distinction between interpretation and application. Okay? And Gadamer explicitly rejects any dichotomy, any complete disjunction between interpretation and application. Because if what interpretation does is to make the text for me, it's already applied in the act of interpretation. Yes. The other thing may be that the suggestion is that just as the history of the church shows a history of growing theological understanding, okay, so that the history of theology begins with, for instance, an attempt to understand God, triune, Chalcedonian formulation, that develops over a period of 3 centuries, 4 centuries.